This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the American soap opera General Hospital that's been running for over 60 years in America. I'll be talking with Alina Adams about it. She's an expert in soaps, and the conversation will begin in a moment. General Hospital is on the docket today, and I'm speaking with a soap opera expert named Alina Adams. Welcome, Alina. I like to give my guests a couple of minutes to describe who they are, what they do. So if you could tell a little background about who you are, your interest in soap operas in general, and anything you want to say about General Hospital specifically.
So who I am, as you said, my name is Alina Adams. I was actually born in the former Soviet Union. I came to the United States in the 1970s, and I learned English from watching soap operas. General Hospital was my gateway drug soap opera. I, of course, started watching the summer of 1980, like a very large part of the world. From that, I moved on to the point where I was watching almost every soap opera in the air. And young people, this is from the days when you actually had to sit next to the TV and crank the knob back and forth so you could see all of them. This is even before the VCR. As you can imagine, once the VCR came to be, that was a huge boon in my soap opera watching. My very first job was working for E! Entertainment on a soap opera show called Pure Soap, which was supposed to be the soap opera version of Talk Soup. People know Talk Soup from E! a lot better in that they showed clips from talk shows. We showed clips from soap operas. After that, I moved to New York in 1994 because of a minor little incident you may have heard called the O.J. Simpson trial. And the O.J. Simpson trial interrupted soaps. So a segment was created called Soapline, which was supposed to catch up viewers on what they had missed while the show was interrupted for the soap opera known as the O.J. Simpson trial. After that, I worked for the Mike and Maddie show, creating soap segments to promote the ABC soap operas. Then eventually I ended up at Procter and Gamble, where I worked for Guiding Light and As the World Turns. My final soap job in TV was after All My Children and One Life to Live were canceled. I worked on their reboots for Prospect Park. Yeah. That didn't go very far, but I worked on those. I am currently a writer for the website Soap Hub, and my latest book is called Super Soap Scenes, a time capsule of daytime drama's greatest moments, where what I did was I queried fans about their favorite soap opera moments, and then after I got those moments, I went to the actors, to the writers, to the producers who had made those moments, interviewed them, and put them in the book. From General Hospital, we have everything from Maxie's heart transplant, which I think was one of the most moving stories ever in soap operas. We have Robin and Stone during their HIV drama. And of course, you cannot have a book called Super Soap Scenes, a time capsule of daytime drama's greatest moments without, yes, Luke and Laura's wedding.
So you mentioned being born in the Soviet Union. Did they have soap operas there?
They did not. They barely had television there. I had actually never even seen television until we came to the United States. I'd seen them. I'd seen the box in people's houses, and I know that pictures lived there, but I had no in-depth love of television until I came to the United States.
I know last year I spoke with a fellow from Australia about the classic women in prison soap opera, Prisoner Cell Block H there. I don't know if you ever heard of that, but that was one of my favorite soaps when I was young. I know we have telenovelas throughout Latin America, but it seems to me that soap operas here, and at least in the U.S., maybe not in Europe. I know Coronation Street is still big over there, EastEnders. It seems that they've shrunk. We've gone from maybe in the 80s heyday of 14, 15, 16 soap operas. We then
at one point there were 20 soaps on the air.
Yeah. And now you're down to just Bold and Beautiful and Young and Restless. Beyond the Gates just started up. You have GH on ABC. And what is it, Days of Our Lives? Is that still going on Peacock?
Yes, Days of Our Lives is streaming on Peacock, which actually makes perfect sense because when you think about soap operas, they start on radio, then they go to television, and it makes perfect sense that now they'd be on streaming. In fact, if you want to take it further back in the other direction, think about the magazine serial story. The classic Dickens novels that we know today were originally released as monthly serialized stories, and the magazines were released in England. They were a little behind in the US. When Dickens did a tour of the US, he was greeted at the boat with people screaming questions about what was going to happen in his stories. So the fact that Days of Our Lives is now streaming on Peacock seems incredibly poetically appropriate. We go from print to radio to television to streaming.
Yeah, back in the 1800s, there was the longest running single character in serialized fiction was a character named Varney the Vampire, who was like 1,000-word segments that ran for like 1,200, 1.2 million words, I think it was. So, you're talking a hell of a lot of episodes that people were reading. So let me just ask you about here in America. In America, you have the three major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and all of the soap operas seem to have been sort of different. You said you wrote about ABC soaps than you did for other networks. ABC soaps from the Luke and Laura era on were generally more adventurous, whereas I don't know about NBC, but when few episodes that I've seen ever of Young and the Restless or Bold and the Beautiful, they seem more like the old stereotype of soap operas being, pregnancies, abortions, affairs, whereas, you'd have these highfalutin wannabe James Bondy and stuff in the 1980s in General Hospital. You've had the, supposed mobsters, the Goodfellas wannabe kind of stuff there. Is there something different about ABC soaps versus the other two networks?
Well, let's pull this back. Certainly when Gloria Monty comes to General Hospital in the late 70s, 1980s, she changes the face of soap operas. Because if we want to go back, why are they even called soap operas? They're called soap operas because Procter & Gamble, who made Ivory soap, in fact, they was so well known that it was called Port Ivory in Staten Island because of their factory there. So they create these serialized stories that women can listen to while they do their housework, preferably with Procter & Gamble products, while they iron and do the laundry. So it was supposed to be like eavesdropping on your neighbors. That was the idea, that you could hear people talking about it. And in fact, Agnes Nixon talked about how writing a soap opera was like dropping a pebble in a pond and then seeing all of the ripples from it. So it was very much supposed to be like sitting down with your neighbor, having a cup of coffee, but then gossiping about all the scandalous stuff that was happening. When Gloria Monty comes in, she's inspired by some of the films that she loved growing up. For instance, with Luke and Laura, the blanket hanging between their beds is straight out of It Happened One Night, the 1944 movie with Clark Gable. So she changes it. But here is what happens. Once Luke and Laura becomes a runaway phenomenon, you can't compare it to anything else. The fact is, prior to Luke and Laura taking over the airwaves, the #1 soap for 20 years was As the World Turns. Mm-hmm. But then what happens is suddenly the Luke and Laura Love on the Run, which is what they called it, infects all of the other soaps. As the World Turns stayed conventional. As the World Turns suddenly has a storyline where Margot and Tom, at that point played by Margaret Colin and Justin Dees, who by the way are still married in real life, they are suddenly going on an adventure where they are fighting a mobster called Mr. Big, who actually in a painfully, I don't even know what to call it, is played by a little person, an actor who's a little person, but he's Mr. Big. And he's got a castle where every room is a puzzle based on either chess or Alice in Wonderland. And suddenly it's Indiana Jones, where if you step on the wrong square, you get shot by an arrow. Meanwhile, over on NBC for Days of Our Lives, you have their super couples, Bo and Hope and Kim and Shane and Steve and Kayla, who are going on adventures where a prism is buried in the ice, and if it's found, it can be a super weapon that blows up the world. So for a while there, it was definitely, for lack of a better word, the Luke and Laura-fication of soap operas. Now, you're absolutely right. Soaps like The Young and the Restless never quite went in that direction. They had some. They had also outdoor shots where they would go to Hawaii, and they would have sort of the the culmination of some storylines would happen outside in gorgeous locales. Even Ryan's Hope, an ABC soap that was supposed to be the more grounded soap, had a storyline where there's a sarcophagus, where there's a virus that's going to infect people. Texas, a soap on NBC, did a straight Raiders of the Lost Ark ripoff where they're going to caves. So definitely in the early 1980s, it was not only General Hospital. On One Life to Live, they went back in time to the Old West. There was an underground city called Eterna. So trust me, everybody got a little bit contaminated by Luke and Laura. It's only now that, in fact, ABC and General Hospital just revisited Luke and Laura's Ice Princess storyline. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but in 1981, the evil villain, Mikos Cassadine, had a synthetic diamond, and somehow, don't ask me how, I was 11 years old, I don't know the details, he was going to freeze the world. Wouldn't that be handy now with global warming? Thanks, Luke and Laura. But the idea is they just revisited it. They had Laura and the leftover Cassadines. Now that Laura Spencer Cassadine is her grandson, they revisited the story of Luke and Laura and the evil weather machine and the toxins and all of that. So while the other soaps have gotten a bit more grounded, General Hospital is plunging ahead. But then again, Days of Our Lives has storylines where they have an evil Dr. Rolf who can either bring people back from the dead or can plant the consciousness of the dead and living people. And currently one of their leading men, EJ, is having these very cryptic conversations with glowing green tubes. So something is in there. So we're still feeling it. Basically, Gloria Monty and Tom Racina, who wrote a lot of the storylines on General Hospital, he had actually earlier written a book that was about Los Angeles being frozen by a supervillain that he used for General Hospital. So what Gloria and Tom Racina began, we're still feeling the echoes of it.
And ABC was the network that did bring you Dark Shadows a decade before Luke and Laura. So.
Well, it was so funny because you mentioned the soap about vampires, and not only did Dark Shadows, which, by the way, its first year, it started as a straight gothic soap. I mean, it was more gothic in that it was, the house on the hill and the wind and the water. It wasn't until Barnabas showed up as the vampire, and suddenly we get Angelique the witch, and we get the werewolf and all of that. And later, General Hospital had a spin-off called Port Charles. And Port Charles started first as it was supposed to be the young doctors of General Hospital. If you watch its first year, it's just supposed to be the interns of General Hospital having perfectly normal for a soap opera adventures. But then next thing you know, there's angels, and Lucy is a vampire hunter and all of that. So vampires have also definitely come in and out of our subs, but we can't blame General Hospital for that. That's going to be Dan Curtis and Dark Shadows.
So I just for your edification, I did start watching, actually 76 or 77, is it Days of Our Lives that had Marlena on it? And
it's still on. Deidre Hall is still with them.
Because I remember her from the Saturday morning show with Electra Woman, was it? Yeah.
And Wonder Cats. It's Electra, and Deborah Winger played her little sister. That was quite the show. And
then there was, and then in around 78, for a summer or so, I watched General Hospital and on and off. That's when the Quartermains came on. And then it was like late 79, early 80 when the Left-Handed Boy storyline came on with Frank Smith.
But before that, you have a really big success with Laura and Scotty.
And actually, I would argue they were the first super couple.
Right. Well, I wouldn't say that because they were definitely popular couples. Doug and Julie on Days of Our Lives were huge before Laura and Scotty. They would have been among the earliers who were that young. I mean, Jeannie was 17. And there's a lot of stuff that when we look back on together, really, they were having a 17-year-old play that? But that's what it was. So people think that the show really exploded with Luke and Laura. And yes, that's when it hit the cultural zeitgeist, but their ratings really started climbing with, like you said, the Quartermains and with the Laura and Scotty story.
And when Scotty helped rescue her from the prostitution house or the whorehouse,
Right. But and before that, she had killed David Hamilton, who was, trying to break up her parents. So that storyline was the beginning. So Luke and Laura wasn't the beginning; they were already on the upward climb when Tony Geary came in to play a 3-day part.
And the famous scene with Jane Elliott and David Lewis, where she withheld her Edward Quatermain's medicines.
Medication, exactly. That's the other thing people tend to forget is, yes, we had Luke and Laura on the run, and that got most of the press. But at the same time, we had the storyline with Alan Jr.'s paternity and Alan trying to kill Monica and Rick by dropping a house on them, but it dropped on him instead. And we have the introduction of Heather Weber.
Yeah.
Richard Dean Anderson is playing Jeff Weber and his crazy ex-wife in the mental institution, who kills their son's adoptive mother and to frame her enemy, and writes it in her blood. I mean, there was a lot of very sort of memorable moments that got overshadowed by Luke and Laura.
Yeah.
But you have to realize that in the early 80s, General Hospital was firing on every cylinder. It wasn't just one story that was working, all the stories were working.
So let's go back to '63 when it debuts. John Berardino is the de facto male lead. He played Dr. Steve Hardy, and the Hardy family still is represented by Rebecca Herbst plays Liz Weber. Yeah, and so the first 15 or so years, though, from everything I've ever heard, from the debut up until the Quatermains and the Luke arriving, it's basically a fairly average soap, isn't it? I mean,
and what's most important is it takes place around the hospital. What I hear all the time now, especially, when I was canvassing fans for my book, one of the things I hear is, why isn't General Hospital a show about a hospital anymore? There's so much intrinsic drama. I mean, forget about daytime, look at nighttime, ER, Grey's Anatomy.
Yeah.
Hospitals are inherently dramatic places. And so for those first 15 years, you're absolutely right. It's a very traditional soap opera, but it's more focused on the hospital than the average show. But yes, you have love triangles, like you have Steve and Audrey and Tom, and you have Jessie and her horrible husband Phil, who I don't know what she saw in him. He was a very bad man. And you have all of that. So yes, it's a very conventional soap opera. No different from other shows on the air at the time, which is As the World Turns, which has a hospital, and Guiding Light, which has a hospital, and Days of Our Lives, which has a hospital, and a show called The Doctors, which, believe it or not, also takes place in a hospital. So it really is a show that is not marginally different from the other examples of its genre, on at the same time and against it.
And one of the most famous early episodes, didn't Mark Hamill have a guest role, a role for it?
Mark Hamill played Teddy on the show. He was, I believe, Jesse's stepson. Yeah, he was on for about a year. Yeah. So yes, Mark Hamill, and then he went off to make that little independent sci-fi movie. Yeah. I wonder how that worked out.
Yeah. So you mentioned Gloria Monty, and there's, I guess, a famous, maybe it's apocryphal, but a famous quote where Geary, when she hires him, says that he doesn't like soap operas, and she says, neither do I, so let's do something about it.
That's a story that gets told a lot about a lot of people. We have on As the World Turns, about 20 years ago, they hired a writer named Hogan Sheffer, who had never worked in soaps before. And he came in and he pretty much said the same thing. I don't like soaps. Or when Harding LeMay was hired for Another World, he said, I don't like soaps. So I wonder if that's how true that story is, since it's been told about pretty much every person who has ever come to soaps and made them a little bit different from what they are. But you know what? That's very dangerous. It's not all Gloria Monty levels of success. The problem is whenever anybody says, I'm going to reinvent the genre, you had better be an amazing success with people who have never watched soaps before, because if you alienate your core audience, you haven't done a very good job, no matter how great you think you are.
Now, when I started watching, you had Richard Simmons had a recurring role on General Hospital as an exercise guru, big stretch for him. And then you had the Frank Smith gangsters started coming on. The Quatermains, as we mentioned, started dominating. I think one of the things that to me was big for General Hospital in the moment, in the first few years of it, but has slowly been a place when you look back, for me, where the soap went awry, was the elevation of Luke to to main character status. People will say, well, he was an anti-hero. Well, no, an anti-hero is someone who sits on the fence. Luke, we know, was involved in the mob. He was a gangster. He does rape Laura in for then a graphic type scene. That's what, if you know the TV Tropes website, that's what we call a popular bad guy. And I think that, and then later with Sonny, the Maurice Bernard character.
I think what's been done with Sonny is 900 times worse than what's been done with Luke. Luke at least had some conflict about the things that he did. Yeah. Sonny is venerated by everyone. In fact, if you don't believe he's the greatest humanitarian who ever lived, then there's obviously something wrong with you. And God forbid you should be a member of the police force who might want to bring down to him Laura. Yeah. Laura, who is now the mayor. Actually, speaking of that, Luke, the first time Luke and Laura leave the show, Luke is the mayor of the show. So he goes from being a thug, and we won't address the rapist piece because that was never made public information, but we do know he's a thug, and we do know he's a mobster. He becomes the mayor. Well, now Laura is the mayor, and Laura is best buddies with Sonny. Laura, who with Luke brought down the mob, because there was a time when the mob was bad. Yeah. In fact, when Luke and Laura returned in the early 90s, they were dealing with Damian Smith, Frank Smith's son, and all of that. And at that time, they still thought mobsters were bad. And here's the interesting thing. So Clara Labine, who had created Ryan's Hope and was the head writer on General Hospital during what I think was their phenomenal renaissance, which is when they had the Maxie's heart transplant storyline and a lot of other incredibly powerful stories, she brought on Sonny. And Claire will be the first one to tell you that Sonny was always supposed to be an anti-hero. He was never supposed to be the hero. He was never supposed to be the star of the show. He was certainly never supposed to be the moral center of the show. Well, that's what it went awry.
Yeah, well, in year one, he was good and he was portrayed as a bad guy. He was cowardly. Jagger, I remember, beat him up. There's this, and here's the scene that's, for me, as infamous or more infamous than the Luke and Laura rape is when Sonny started out as a strip club owner, he was employing underage girls. He had his procurer be the kid Stone, who later dies of AIDS, which I never liked that character, not the actor, but the character I never liked of Stone. And then there were a number of scenes where it's implied heavily that he was drugging the girls and
having... I think it was implied. I think it was flat out stated he was drugging an underage girl so she would strip for him, and then he slept with her. That was Karen, and also who turned out to be Scotty's daughter, and Scotty is unreasonable for resenting Sonny to this day.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, there's the scene I remember where Jag is trying to make his way up to the apartment and he catches them in bed. But before that, there was a scene that I know because I had videotaped it. I used to videotape it, and you see him doing a little something, slipping a little Mickey, and people say, "Well, she turned 18, so it wasn't rape." Well, no. If you're putting someone under the influence of something, even something that's not going to kill them, I mean, to me, but the thing is, they finally came in the 90s clean with the Luke stuff, just like they did with Todd Manning in One Life to Live, just like they scrubbed Franco because, and he actually didn't even rape a person. He only supposedly paid to have Michael raped in prison. But for some reason, the whole Sonny and Karen thing is all, even when they brought back that blonde guy to play the new Jagger, the new version of Jagger, again, everyone is thrown under the altar of Sonny, and I know so many people who are GH fans who will not watch because of Sonny, Jason, Carly, and Sam, because they would always win.
Here's what I would say with Jason. At least with Jason, they flat out said he has brain damage. He was in a car accident. A piece of his brain was damaged. So the fact that he now has no moral center at least has some sort of medical validity. He is a person with a disability that, oh, by the way, Sonny exploited. Yeah. Sonny took a person with brain damage and turned him into a hitman. Sonny, no matter how many times he tells us what a sad childhood he had. This is as bad as, I don't know if you watched The Young and the Restless, but Victor Newman mentions that his mother left him in an orphanage, I would say 3 times a day. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but it's definitely multiple times a year, and whenever anybody calls Victor Newman out on anything, it's like, I was left in an orphanage as a child, which is why everything I do for my family is right now. Shut up, you got that? So no matter how many times Sonny sobs about, his stepfather smacked him around,
Yeah.
It doesn't make it okay. So here's the episode that for me was the nail in the coffin. I have always hated Sonny. This is not news. Anyone who follows me on social media or my writing in Soap Hub knows that I hate Sonny, just like they know I hate Victor Newman. But so when they did the episode that what would have happened if Sonny had never come to Port Charles and become Saint Mobster of Port Charles is, get this, Robin would have died of AIDS, because without Sonny, there would not have been a Stone Kates Memorial Wing at General Hospital, and Robin would not have been able to get her meds. Robin, the daughter of two super spies with connection to the WSB. Robin, who is beloved by the Quartermains, who can certainly afford to buy meds if for some reason Robin, the doctor, could not. So not only would the world have been a sadder, darker place without Sonny, but Robin would have died instead of living with HIV. That is the level that we have hit on General Hospital.
Yeah, and Sonny, who's the drug dealer who gave Stone the drugs, which got him the AIDS. Sonny, who blew Jax's plane out of the sky with a domestic terrorist, and so on and so forth. But let's take a break here, and we'll come back. We'll talk more about the 1980s. Alina, the early 1980s, there were a plethora of really great storylines, and even beyond Luke and Laura. I interviewed Brian Patrick Clark about 7-8 years ago. The Prometheus disc thing, which brought on the DVX.
I have watching soaps for, let me do the maths, 1980, what is it, 45, something like 45 years. I have only been truly surprised by soaps twice in my life. Here they are. The first one was that Grant was the spy, the Russian spy. I mean, I knew obviously Natalie was the spy because whenever they talked about the spy, the next scene would feature Natalie. And even though I was 12 years old, I still figured that out. The fact that Grant was the Russian spy, and you have to understand, especially for me, having been born in the Soviet Union, that storyline was infinitely amusing on multiple levels. Yeah. And the only other time I have ever been surprised by a plot twist on a soap was also on General Hospital, and it was when Grant Putnam was the snowman who was terrorizing Anna and put Robin in a coma. And since I also hate, loathe, and really despise Robin, that was great. A Quiet Robin is a wonderful Robin, but the only two times I have ever been surprised by a soap opera twist, both of them were Brian Patrick Clark.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the best stories. I remember the one who became Grant Andrews, the Russian who was actually the good guy rather than the American who was really a bad serial killer. The Grant Andrews character had a really good relationship with, I don't know the actor's name, but Dr. Gerald, who was an older father figure to him.
Yeah, he was his mentor and his father figure, the one that he had to kill. Oh, and that's when I learned the very important thing, that because he shot him and he had to make it look like a suicide, he put the gun to his head and shot it again, because apparently sometimes there's a ricochet effect when people shoot themselves in the head. This is a piece of information I've had since I was 12 years old. Haven't had occasion to use it, but it's a piece of information I have.
Yeah, so I mentioned, so that was probably my favorite all-time story, and that after that Luke and Laura left the show.
Well, right, because that story was brought in. Luke had been presumed dead, which is how Natalie, the physical therapist, came back with.
In the avalanche.
Right, Luke was presumed dead in the avalanche, but that was also the beginning of Robert and Holly, who my all-time favorite couple. So the Prometheus disc folded into that storyline because you had Luke opening the casino, and you had Connie, who was the WSB agent, working with him, and it was still whether or not Holly was going to pick Luke or Robert. So, and this is something really, really important. So One Life to Live, I'm going to go off on a lot of tangents, but they're interesting to soap fans. So One Life to Live, when Linda Gottlieb was the executive producer of One Life to Live, and I had worked for her on that project called Soapline that I mentioned, so I knew Linda. And they had done a story with the AIDS quilt, and with the character of Billy coming out, Billy played by a very, very young Ryan Philippe. And one of the things that Linda said to me she wished they had done differently with that story is there should have been a love story in it. Because as it was, they just did it as a social issue story. There was no love story. And I'm bringing this back to the Prometheus disc because, yes, the Prometheus disc story was awesome. It was the fate of the world. It was the U.S. versus USSR. But at its heart, it was about Robert and Holly and Luke.
Yeah.
And I don't think the story would have been as successful no matter how many discs blew up the world if it didn't have that at its heart.
Yeah, and they did so many good outdoor stories, big stories. A few weeks ago when I decided to do contact some people for this, I saw the episode, at least 30 minutes out of the episode, where Sean Donnelly and Robert, Sean had been the mentor, Robert, they're on the tramway.
That is that moment where Sean realizes that he didn't kill Robert is one of my top 10 soap opera moments. Just the expression on his face when he thinks he's killed Robert by pushing him off the tram, and then Robert comes to arrest him. Brilliant.
And here's the thing. The two characters that I think should have been bigger villains on the show that they never took it was John Riley as Sean Donnelly. He was boring when he was a good guy, but he was a great villain. And the other one is, you mentioned the dropping of the house. I think Stu Damon is one of my all-time favorite GH actors. They still haven't done a tribute show to him 17 years after he died or whatever it was.
They had 30 seconds at the end of an episode where without music they just showed slow motion clips.
Yeah. But I mean, Epiphany got her a whole tribute to her, and nothing against the Epiphany actress, but she's a minor character. But Stuart Damon, the way his face would contort with rage against Monica, I just don't understand why they didn't use him more like that. He could have been involved in the Cassadine thing or something. Which brings us to you mentioned the Ice Princess, and I love the original Cassadine brothers, the trio, Teo Pengelis, what's his name, John Colicos, John
from Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah.
To my husband, he's what is
Star
it
Trek.
called?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Battlestar Galactica.
Okay.
Baltar from Battlestar Galactica, and
he's an iconic Klingon on Star Trek, the original shows too.
Yeah, but he was also the original in the original Battlestar Galactica.
And then I think Andre Lanzat or something.
Landazat as Tony. Yeah, I love Tony, and I loved Alexandra, who was Edward's niece. I love Tony and Alexandra, and I think they only used them for like one summer. And look, this is nothing against Sharon Wyatt. She's lovely as Tiffany. But if I had to choose between Alexandra and Tiffany, I'd have taken Alexandra in a heartbeat.
Yeah, and the whole early 80s, I enjoyed a lot of the other shows too. Blackie Parrish, played by John Stamos.
Another guy who was supposed to do only 2 days, and then that turned into a long stint.
Yeah, and so we never know what happened to his character. He went off to jail.
He was still in jail. Yeah. I mean, Sonny gets out every 12 minutes, and Blackie Parrish is still in jail.
I also in the early days, you mentioned Heather Weber, Robin Matson's version of Heather Weber. I mean, God, I just loved her. And she had that creepy little friend of hers in the loony bin that she was in.
Yeah, Sarah. She had Sarah who walked around with the doll.
Right.
Yeah, and he was using her to cover for all of her escapes.
And I mentioned the Australian soap opera on Women with Prisoner Cell Block H. This was the closest thing we had in America was Heather when she was in the Nut House. That was great. You had the other stories. You had well, let's see. After the Prometheus disc, you had later. Sean Cassidy had a role on as a DVX.
That year was not a great year. Do you remember the year when it was all about some bottled water in another town? Bobby's stepdaughter Terry.
Laurelton. The Laurelton Rose.
Suddenly we were in some other town, and it was something about water and old people. We did, and Charlie and Bosley from Charlie's Angels were there. And Steve Austin's mother from The Bionic Woman was there. And the guy who had initially filled in for Jack Wagner as Frisco was suddenly a guy named Kevin. And he had a brother named Pat. and Anna was running around and something, 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 something. And then Sean Cassidy sang a song and they went to a mountain. That is not a peak year for General Hospital.
Well, but you're mixing the two up. Sean Cassidy only came on about 2 years later. The Laurelton story was 85 to 86. Cassidy was...
I felt like it went into that. That was a bad period of General Hospital when they were bringing in sort of stunt casting and not really doing much with them.
I disagree about the stuff with the two brothers and the serial killer. I thought the Kevin O'Connor character was along with Grant Putnam and then later John Lindstrom's Ryan Chamberlain. Mm-hmm. I thought that those were the three classic serial killer storylines in the golden age, if you want to call it that.
I'm not a huge fan of serial killers because here's the thing with serial killers, not as a concept. I mean, I'm not saying I don't like serial killer stories. The same reason I don't like business stories, because if your beef with someone, as the young people say, I have teenage children, if your beef with someone has to do with money or some abstract thing, that to me just isn't as compelling as an emotional story. So that's why I don't find serial killers interesting. Yeah. They're killing randomly, and when someone's killed randomly, I don't have an emotional connection to it, and when I don't have an emotional connection to it, I don't care. So that's where I come in with the serial killers. The serial killers with Grant Putnam, we cared because he was after Grant Andrews and after Celia.
And there was a nice twist on the evil twin thing because they weren't twins, but the evil one was the one you expected to be good, and the one you expected to be evil was good.
And with John Lindstrom, again, the story was because he was after Maxie, a character.
No,
and
Felicia
character.
Yeah.
Well, it was, he was Maxie's pediatrician.
Yeah.
That's how. And Felicia, and then it was the relationship between the two brothers. Whereas I felt with the Kevin O'Connor, we didn't know him. Yeah. We didn't know his brother. We didn't know his entire town. Our only connection was Terry, and Terry we only cared about because she was Bobby's stepdaughter versus a guy who was never a great relationship to begin with. It was very tenuous to me.
And they should never have killed off David Groh, her father, Terry's father. He was a terrific baddie after being beloved on Rhoda.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the whole thing. That's why that period of General Hospital, when they brought in so many new faces and tied them only tentatively to the cast that we cared about. That's another issue, a mistake that a lot of people make when they come into a new show, is they bring in their own people and they back burner. So here's actually going back to what I said earlier, is that, when Gloria Monty came on, and she brought on, the Quartermains, but she did, remember, Laura existed. She didn't create Laura. All she did was age Laura and recast her with Ginny Francis, because at that point, Laura, we knew, was Leslie's biological daughter who was living with her adoptive family at the time. That's how Amy became Laura's sister. So she did age Laura, but she tied her into Leslie, who people had a relationship with, and Rick, who people had a relationship with. But that said, not so much these days, but when I was working at Pure Soap and writing that show, I would talk to fans who were still angry. Where's Steve? Where's Audrey? Where's Jesse? Yeah. These were the characters they were attached to, and suddenly in comes Gloria Monty and brings in all these new people, and that's what we got with Laurelton. Yeah. Laurelton was suddenly a half dozen brand new people, tentatively connected to the people we cared about, and I just did not.
And it's why the Eckert family didn't work. Even though I thought Bill Eckert was a more existential and interesting character than Luke was, but what did I write something there? Oh, I was gonna, when you were talking about Laura being played by differently, I was saying, thank God they didn't keep Scotty as Johnny Whitaker from Sigmund and the Sea Monsters.
Well, on the other hand, all that hair, he did have lovely hair. Let's not mock Johnny Whitaker. Yes. So that's the whole thing. And earlier, the Laura had been played by a 12-year-old, and then she reconnected with a 15-year-old. Jeannie had that she'd run away from home. She was living in a cult, and so that's sort of that reset Laura.
Yeah. And so in the 80s, what do you think was a storyline or a character that was really great, but just is sort of forgotten in the whole Luke and Laura, and Frisco and Felicia then as the next super couple?
Well, my issue has more to do with, you mentioned forgotten. So as I said, I was a huge Robert and Holly fan. And so with every return of Holly, it's gotten worse and worse and worse. to the point where the Holly we saw in her last two returns had no relationship to the one that we knew then. And on top of which, the first time she returned, which was in 2006, not the first time she came back from the dead, but in 2006 when Robert came back from the dead, and it was the monkey virus again. Okay. They were acting as if Holly's relationship with Luke was equal to Holly's relationship with Robert, which for anyone who was watching at the time made absolutely no sense. So I don't, online they tend to call her Pod Holly because she is not the real Holly. She's a Holly that was hatched from a pod.
Well, and that's one of the things with some characters. I mean, the obvious one, Maurice Bernard and especially Carly have not grown up. But Emma Samms, God love her, she still looks gorgeous, but she can't pronounce. Her English has deteriorated. She mumbles more than she ever did. Put her back in the introductory shot when she was in that what do they call it, body stocking, swimming and Luke.
In the lake. That was a fun story. That was actually a story where you brought it to. That's a classic example. So actually, let's talk about who didn't work. Not because she was not star quality, Demi Moore. They bring on Demi Moore to be Luke's new love interest, and nobody can say Demi Moore doesn't have presence or charisma, but it doesn't work. Then they bring in Emma Samms, and it does work.
And Janine Turner was her sister.
Yeah, Janine Turner was, she was part of okay, let's talk about the Sword of Malkuth. Let's talk about Luke shirtless, holding a sword above his head, like I swear to God he is He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, which is what brought us that Laura. We knew that was never going to work because you were never going to slip in another Laura.
Well, and anyone who didn't know that Tony Geary was gay with that after that pose wasn't paying attention.
Well, okay, again, I was 12, so maybe I didn't know it, but it was not relevant. The point is, Sword of Malkuth, He-Man, Masters of the Universe, no. Let's just make a large no with the universal sign for no, the circle with the line through it. Then it's not that Demi Moore doesn't have personality or charisma. She didn't work. You bring in Emma Samms. She works. You bring in her family, but very, very, very sparingly. And then you kill most of them off and you just leave Holly. And that works. As opposed to if we had brought in Holly and her entire family and let them take over the show.
Yeah. In the 1980s, they started running out of juice. I think the last story that you could say was a big story that was in what I would call the golden era of, say, the late 70s to the early 90s was the cartel story that they reused Faison. He came on for about a year, then they mixed him up and Bill Eckert came on and Mac blew up the tanker or something. As I said, the thing that I liked about the Bill Eckert character that I have to say is he had such a great relationship with the kid who played Sly.
Oh, fabulous.
And I remember the last week there was a scene between Bill and Sly where they're talking about life, love, father-son relationship. One of the most well-written scenes that I've ever seen on any television medium. And why they bring him on and then after 2 years they make him a fucking pirate.
This episode of Seinfeld where Jerry keeps going, I don't want to be a pirate. That's what it was. But the kid, Glenn Walker Harris, that was his name. The kid who played Fly was fabulous. And for a while there, they were making it seem like he would be living with Luke and Laura and with Luck. They should have kept him because, yes, Jonathan Jackson was terrific. If you thought they hit pay dirt with Glenn Walker Harris Jr., they did it again with Jonathan Jackson. Both those boys were fabulous. And then, they threw Amber Tamlin into the mix. So, yay, Mark Teschner, GH's casting director. Amazing work. But I think they should have kept Sly around. They should have just eased him into Luke and Laura and have him grow up as Lucky's brother, because that would have just added a really great character to the canvas.
Now, you talk about those young actors. Let's talk about the phenomenon of young actors who are great when they're young, but they don't really work as they're older. I'm thinking of Kimberly McCullough. I think as an adult, what works as a kid, being cute, having a wise mouth or something, doesn't translate over. The Lucky played by Jonathan Jackson. All the people on the board that I'm on is like, oh, weepy Lucky, the Lucky who cries and can barely grow a beard.
Well, that also, writing has a part of that. The fact is they've never known what to do with Lucky. And I actually have a theory, and you're going to hear it now because you foolishly invited me onto this podcast. So one of the most recast characters in soap opera histories, there's two, and I want to talk about them. One was the character of Tom, and As the World Turns, who was played by over a dozen people. And the other was the character of Patty on Search for Tomorrow, who was also played by over a dozen people. And here is my theory. And the reason they have the hardest time casting characters who were born and grew up on the show is because we watched them grow up on the show. They can't sneak in past traumas or secrets or things that they can bring out. They are much more shackled because we saw them grow up on the air. Like on Another World, they had a character named Sally who we saw grow up on the air, but she was off the canvas for a couple of years. So when she returned, they said, oh, she had a baby and gave it up for adoption. They can do little things like that. But if the character was on screen pretty much nonstop, from birth, or in the case of Kimberly McCullough, from when she was 7 years old, you are straitjacketed. Because you can't write the kind of backstory that you would to a new character. So they keep recasting and recasting in the hope that, they'll get a fresh perspective on the character, which is why you get characters like Jamie Frame on Another World, who was also born on the air. In some incarnations, he's a deep emo. Again, I have teenage children. That wasn't the word they used at the time. He's a deep emo novelist. Then suddenly he's a swashbuckling doctor. Then suddenly he's an entrepreneur. Then suddenly he's something else. They bring in new actors, but it's the same character and they're stuck. And I think that's what you have with Robin, and that's what you have with Lucky, and that's what you even had that. Why did they have to basically reboot Jason? Yeah. Because the Jason we had played by Steve Burton, everybody makes fun of the goofy sweaters, but he was just a nice, sweet guy who loved his parents and had that cute little relationship with I don't remember what was her name, but she was the one she was Taggart's sister. No, so Justice.
Keisha.
That's it. Yeah. So that was very successful. Yeah. Whenever we think of Jason now and being a serial killer and all of that, talk about a very successful way to take an uninteresting, unpopular character, keep the actor, and completely reboot him. That was great. But unless you do something that drastic, you are stuck with the character that they were when they were 5.
I believe Steve Burton had just done Playgirl then, and he was threatening to leave the show, and they wanted to keep it on, so they did what he wanted with the character.
It was, again, I believe that was Claire Labine, and I believe they did an excellent, excellent job. But most of the time, whether you're Tom on As the World Turns, or Jamie on Another World, or Patty on Search for Tomorrow, or Robin and Lucky on General Hospital, you're really kind of stuck.
Yeah, and that's why you get the soap opera rapid aging syndrome.
Well, they just went, because there's 2 stages of soap opera rapid aging syndrome. First is when they're about a year old and they start walking, and you literally can't hold them onto the set. There are so many shots of them trying to keep the kid who was trying to get out. So they usually will age them to about 5, when they can take direction and actually say lines. And then the next time you age them is around where they're 12 or 13, when they're no longer cute and adorable, but you can't have a love interest. So then they age them to about 15 and hire a 23-year-old to play them. With some of the biggest jumps on The Young and the Restless, when they aged Victoria and Nicholas. And there's other characters like that. Robin, Kimberly McCullough, is one of the few actors who didn't have that. But here's the thing. So they kept Kimberly McCullough her own age, and Kimberly was playing her own age, but she was in the storyline with Stone. But then when they'd have them all in one scene, they'd have Robin, Stone, Karen, Jason, and Brenda, and it was so obvious that Kimberly was like a decade younger than the rest of them, even though she was the only one playing her own actual age. It's just that, guess what? Real life 17-year-old girls don't look like 27-year-old supermodels.
Yeah. So the 1990s on General Hospital, we got away from the super spies and the spy stuff. Maurice Bernard's Sonny comes to town just a year or 2 after it'll look like Nico Kelly left All My Children.
So my husband to this day will walk through, because he was an All My Children watcher from day 1 to the last day. He'll walk by and say, what have they done to Nico? He's still stuck there.
And yeah, so they bring him on, and then you get again more focus. You mentioned the Tony and the BJ's Heart, one of the most famous one.
Mhm.
You had the brownstone, the characters that lived at Bobby's brownstone there, and of course my favorite, the Quartermains with Sean Kanan as
AJ.
AJ. This is the pre-crash Steve Burton. This is Monica and Alan to me at their best. John Ingle takes over for David Lewis, and I have to say something. As much as I love John Ingle and he was good at it, David Lewis was a fantastic fucking actor. That guy, he was a minor character actor throughout, Golden Hollywood age.
You can see him on the old classic Batman.
Yeah, he was just fabulous as Edward Quartermain.
He had much more of an edge. John Ingle was much more avuncular and friendly. Grandfather David Lewis was a badass.
So what did you think? Did you think of the 1990s compared to the 80s?
Well, here's what I like in the 1990s. As I said, when Claire Labine is there. Now, a lot of people said it was really depressing because you had BJ's Heart, Monica's breast cancer, which also included the death of Emily's biological mother, and Stone's AIDS. At the same time, a lot of people thought, wow, this is a really depressing show. But at least, it became a hospital show. And also, Claire Labine is phenomenal at writing character-driven scenes. And in fact, at the time, I was working for Pure Soap. And what we got at the time was we got the show's breakdowns ahead of time so that we can plan our own shows. And I remember when the storyline began, which would culminate with the heart transplant, which also included Bobby and Stefan and Damien and all of these people. I remember reading it like it was a novel. I was leafing through those breakdowns like it was a novel. It was so compelling. Yeah. And I remember saying to Claire, I said, the beauty of that storyline was that everything felt inevitable, but not predictable. Mm-hmm. You didn't know what was going to happen, but when it happened, you could see how all the pieces had come together perfectly, and that was Claire Labine at her very best. So I absolutely love that. And after that, we actually get Bob Guza's first tenure, which was really not bad, because that's when he reintroduces sort of the Cassadine as a power. Mm. And I got to say, so when Luke and Laura returned, and I believe in 93, I realized that poetically, the threat they were facing had to come from Frank Smith because that was the first threat they faced. But really, if you want to talk about realistic, as if realism was a term that you could use in the soap opera, if you're talking about someone who could track them to anywhere in the world so that they had to be hiding out in the wilds of Canada, that wasn't going to be Frank Smith. That was going to be the Cassadines. Yeah. The fact is, if Luke and Laura were terrified of an all-powerful force, it had to be the Cassadines, not Frank Smith. So when they moved on to Bob Guza's storyline Endgame, where you remember when Stefan was going to take the world over from his laptop, still not quite sure if that was going to work, that was at least some epic writing.
Well, I remember. Well, Connie Towers. I always loved her from the 50s and 60s. As Helena, she was so great. Until it got to the point where she can barely she's got the shakes and she's holding up a dagger to someone's throat. Maybe her 10-year run would have worked well for her rather than 25 years before they finally killed off her character. But yeah, that she was terrific. The Cassadines there. What I didn't like, of course, was when they brought Stavros, because Stavros in his first incarnation in the mid '80s. Was not the son of Mikos. He was just a Cassadine, an unspecified. And then
they said he was a cousin that Helena married off to Laura as a way to control her, but he wasn't the center of Helena's universe.
Yeah, and so that I enjoyed there. One of the things, though, talked about the failure of the Ecker clan, and I wanted to ask you too. Because as we get into the 21st century, the last quarter century, I think a lot of mistakes were made in terms of characters. I wanted to talk and ask you about them. The first one was with the character of Sonny. By allowing Maurice Bernard to bring in his own bipolarity into the character, I think that was a big mistake, because what that does is, it since people that are watching this are going to know this because of the publicity it gets, it weakens the storyline, and it makes it makes a lot of people feel more for the Sonny character because of what the actor's going through, rather than the fact that, as we've said, he's a terrorist, a rapist, a mass murdering mobster, drug dealer.
I read Maurice Benard's autobiography, and where he talked about being bipolar, and at no point being bipolar did, at least as far as he admitted, cause him to rape, extort, or anything else. But on the show, and in fact, that's actually very disrespectful of people who struggle with mental illness, because the fact is, it's not an excuse for everything that Sonny does. And it's used for whenever Sonny actually gets put into prison. Sonny goes, oh, I'm claustrophobic. Oh, no, I'm sad in prison. And people go, oh, okay, then he shouldn't be in prison. I bet a lot of people in prison don't like being in prison. I'm almost going to, I haven't never taken a poll, but I'm pretty sure that most people who are in prison would rather not be there.
And the other thing I think that it does, and I think this is true with Tony Geary too, is as he got older, from Tony Geary was supposedly allowed to rework lines that he didn't like. And what happens is, I think that both of them got very lazy as actors. They could still occasionally have days...
And that made it so much noticeable, the days they didn't phone it in,
yeah.
is you could see what they were still capable. But the worst thing they allowed Tony Geary to do is they allowed him to rewrite the history of Luke and Laura, saying he hated being a parent, he hated being tied down, he hated being married. Now, maybe if they'd been off screen for 20 years, maybe we would have believed it, but we saw him. When Luke and Laura returned in 93, this was not a man feeling trapped. This was a man living the life he wanted to live. This was a man who loved being a father, who was thrilled when Laura was pregnant with Lulu. We saw it. We saw all of it, and allowing Tony Geary, because this was Tony Geary, this wasn't the writing staff, to rewrite it so that Luke always felt trapped and always wanted to be a vagabond was just, it was insulting to the fans, but it was also just bad writing, because that's not the character we saw.
But I think even worse was the Fluke storyline, because we literally saw Fluke visit Luke in prison with actual flesh and blood guards, and then they made it all in his mind, and then we got the whole retcon of, well, it wasn't a retcon, it was bringing his sister back that was originally mentioned in 78, the older sister, but then we got that terrible black and white thing with him killing his father and whatnot. And
okay, I have a question before we go into any detail. The father they wrote was basically Archie Bunker Redux.
Right.
And remember, he talked about how he hated all the various ethnic groups, including, and I quote, the Italians. Yeah. Would a person who hated the Italians name his son Lucas Lorenzo Spencer?
Well, that's the thing is, Luke mentioned that he was always half Italian. That he had that Italian in that because the Eckerd woman because Luke's mother was the sister to Bill Eckerd's mother, who was Italian as played, which again made no sense. So they took basically 40 years of Spencer family history, and because Geary didn't like it, they fucked it all up.
Yes, that is exactly. Not to mention the fact that the Quartermains wanted to adopt the little orphan Spencer children, and that never came up in all the time. Especially, okay, forget Edward doesn't remember, but Lila. This wouldn't have come up when Lila dealt with Bobby and with Luke. Yeah, it was completely ridiculous. And that's when I say, if you're going to come in and you're going to rewrite a complete show, you better be really good at it, because at most, all you're going to do is alienate the current fans and not pick up any new ones.
And the thing, some of the people that are on the board that I talk about General Hospital with, the two things that I think drive them the craziest about Maurice Benard's Sonny character is, whenever he's trying to be threatening, he whispers. Now you're 5'4" tall. You know you have shoe black on your hair. I mean, and so it's so ridiculous. And the thing that gets me so much is that because Benard was terrific in the first year or two. He was terrific as Nico Kelly on All My Children. He was terrific the first year or two as Sonny when they played him as a bad guy. You know, I'm not one who buys the villains are more interesting than heroes. I think that's indicative of bad and lazy writing, that you can't make a hero as interesting as a bad guy. But Sonny was interesting. He had so much interesting potential, and that's the thing too. Is his mother was Adela, was supposedly Italian, who went to Cuba.
Cuba, I think.
Yeah,
Cuba.
Yeah, but she was ethnically Italian and went to Cuba, and Sonny's father No, not his father. Michael.
Yep.
Well, that's another thing. Why is it Corbin? Why Corinthos? He's Greek. I mean, he's half Greek.
Their names. Let's put it this way: of all the things that offend me about Sonny, the fact that his father changed his name is not really up there in the top 175. Yeah. But yeah, I think his mother was. I thought his mother was supposed to be Cuban and his father was supposed to be Greek. I thought that was the original story we'd been given.
Yeah, she but I think he was Cuban Italian because, but whatever. And we have to, if you're talking to Sonny, you have to talk about Carly, and I think the original Carly, as portrayed by Sarah Brown. I loved
amazing. All those 3 Emmys that she won back to back, she deserved every single one of them. Sarah Brown's Carly took a character that wasn't much on paper and gave her a whole inner life that made her fascinating.
Right, and ever since Tamara Braun was okay, but wasn't up to that. The third one, whose name I forget,
just her. It was for something.
Yeah, and then Laura Wright. I like her personally, but she's a standard actress. She doesn't raise scenes, she doesn't screw up scenes. But that's the thing with when you get a Sarah Brown is she can take pablum and make it great just by the force of her presence. And there was such a lot. And when she came back as Claudia, I thought Claudia was also a good character, not quite the original Carly, but that's because.
Too narrow. They wrote Claudia too narrow.
Yeah.
So she didn't have the kind of opportunities that she did when she was Carly to really take it in different directions.
And if they had been smart, they would have somehow gotten Sonny out of the gangster stuff, and they would have kept Bruce Weitz as Anthony Zaccara. That he was so great and over the top with it. I mean, that he was giving great soap opera performance rather than great dramatic performance. You know, he had he started as supposedly crazy. He ends up becoming a serial killer and whatnot. But what do you think of the arc of the Carly character from Sarah Brown through Laura Wright?
I just think that the Sarah Brown Carly, first of all, was full of self-loathing, which it was a way to get you, while not to forgive her, to at least empathize with her, because that's the Carly that we met. She went from a Carly that hated herself, obviously was coming from a place of what was wrong with me that my mother gave me up. Yeah. Although she had a loving adoptive mother. It's actually very interesting. It was I thought the arc was very similar to with On All My Children, with the character of Erica and her mother Mona. When Erica's long lost daughter Kendall came back, she also was full of anger, even though she had a loving adoptive mother.
But at least she wasn't a fetus that was saved.
That's Josh. We call him the unabortion. Josh, unabortion. I was actually telling one of my kids about that storyline the other day. They looked at me like I was just punking them. But yes, that would be Josh.
He looked like a younger, better looking Tom Cruise though, and then he disappeared.
Yeah, so that was Josh the Unabortion. But so it was very similar in that Erica talked about to Kendall's adoptive mother about how she never appreciated her mother because she was just she thought she was a simple person. And I think that's what we got with Carly is she had all this self-loathing because of how she grew up in Florida and she didn't feel that she fit in. And then there was, why would my biological mother give me up? What was wrong with me? So we went from a very vulnerable, despite all the terrible things she did, Carly, to a Carly now that is so smug and feels that she's always right and everything that she does is right and everything that her children do is right, to the point where we have Carly, stealing Willow's kids and all sorts of other things. That I think the arc, if we want to call it that, is we went from a Carly with no self-esteem to a Carly with a no end to her self-esteem.
It's interesting because the Carly character talks about her grown kids as if they're children. I must protect Michael. Michael is a fucking 35-year-old man who was raped in prison and survived it. You think he's not going to be able to survive without his mommy? What's he going to bring his little nipple to suck on? I mean, it's so ridiculous character. But I do have to then talk about the 21st century version of Carly, which was Chloe Lanier's Nell, which again I think took an utterly stereotypically bad kind of character, and Chloe Lanier is one of the. I say Chloe Lanier, Sarah Brown. They remind me of the Canadian actress who played what's her name? The one who played Anne of Green Gables. What's her name? No, Megan Follows. Yeah.
She's terrific.
Yeah, but those three actresses I'd never seen a bad performance from them, even in other soap operas. What did you think about the whole? Because to me, the only good thing that came out of the Fluke thing
Oh
was
yeah,
she got a
Chloe.
contract.
No, I'm not surprised they signed her. It's like when I was working at Guiding Light, they brought, she's now Bethany Joy Lenz. At the time she was Joy Lenz. They brought her to play clone Riva. Yeah, so other stories have also gone on. Guiding Light, when Kim Zimmer's character of Riva was presumed dead, they brought Joy Lenz on to play clone Riva, and she was so fabulous that it made perfect sense that they brought her back to play Michelle Bauer later, because she just popped off the screen, especially she was so young. I think she was 17 or 18. And it was the same with Chloe Lanier. When you saw her do that one-shot bit as the sister nobody really talked about, I wasn't surprised that they brought her back, and she deserved to be brought back, because talk about someone who lit up the screen just by being on it.
Alina, I mentioned the term SORAS, or soap opera rapid aging syndrome. Another thing that has always afflicted soap operas in general, and General Hospital is no exception, is retconning. And for me, I don't like retcons when they take beloved characters and just rub them in the dirt. 20-some years ago, just this year, Chris Robinson, who played Rick Weber, he was the second Rick Weber. He had the son Mike Weber that he adopted from the Rich Barrington family, and they had a story around the turn of the century. He comes back when Laura was sitting in the attic, rocking back and forward, and they just destroyed the character. They made him a monster.
It was not only that, but let's talk about even little things. First of all, forget the fact that suddenly Laura killed two people in that house. Laura was, talk about serial killers. I think Laura is going to give some of the serial killers a run for their money. Yes, so first Laura not only killed David Hamilton, she also killed Rick's mistress, which means Rick was cheating on Leslie at the time. Now, he did cheat later with Monica, but the whole point is why it was so dramatic is because it wasn't a common thing. It wasn't like he was a guy who cheated on his wife all the time. It was a huge betrayal. He still did love Leslie. He just happened to want to sleep with Leslie Charleston, who's very hot. We all get that. But on top of that, so here's the little things. And actually, this is so interesting because it's so key to soaps. Soap fans remember the big things. Obviously, they remember the big moments. But sometimes it's the little things that makes the most difference. And here's what first drove me nuts in that storyline. It wasn't that Laura had killed this woman in the attic. It wasn't that Rick was cheating on Leslie when we knew he wasn't. It was that Laura was calling him Rick, and she called him Dad. She always called him Dad. And Lucky, who at that point was played by Jacob Young, Lucky is calling him Rick. And it's hard to believe that the Laura that we knew, who called Rick Dad, that her son would call him Rick and not Grandpa. And that was just told you how unfamiliar with the original characters these writers were. And it just told you how little they cared about the history of it. And I know in the end, you have Nicholas and Lucky basically doing Weekend at Bernie's with Rick's body. But to me, it was that little detail that Laura called him Dad. She didn't call him Rick.
Yeah, and again, it wasn't as egregious as the whole Fluke rewrite of the Spencer family history, but like you said, if you've invested into something for 10, 20, 30, 40 years watching it, and you know this character, you not only know the character, but you know their mother, you know their grandfather, you know their great uncle Bill, who came in 3 times a year on benders. You know this, literally, and I'm hardly as fanatic as anyone else is, but there are times when I'll wake up, or maybe I'll even have a dream, and it'll be from a character. I had it. Someone mentioned on the board that I frequent, mentioned something about a character in the days, and I thought of the actor Leonard Stone, who played Packy, and it was because it was Johnny Morrissey character that was with the original Amy, Laura's sister.
Yeah, that's the boxer. Yes, that was the whole very small.
And I looked the guy up, Miles McNamara, and it's like, why am I thinking about Miles McNamara 40 years after the fact? It's not like he was Luke or he was Robert Scorpio. He was on for 8 months or something, and what was a C or D story, but these characters.
I'll give you another name. So do you remember Lorena Sharp?
Oh yes, Monica's sister. Yes.
Cousin. She was actually
cousin.
Monica's
Okay, yeah.
cousin. And so she was played by Shelley Taylor Morgan.
And
And
Steve
Shelley
Bond
Taylor,
she slept with.
yes, yes. And Shelley Taylor Morgan was who hosted the show that I wrote, Pure Soap. She was the host of that show. So Shelley and I are still friends. And there's people who, she was on the show. I don't think she was on the show for even 2 years. But the fact is, she was a character. She was Monica's long lost cousin. And also, she had the whole relationship with Leo the masseuse, who was played by Callahan, who then went on to Santa Barbara, and of course All My Children. So these are I think Leo the masseuse was probably on less than a year. It was part of some story. He had a spa, and
it's before he became Edmund on All My Children.
Yes, exactly. In between that, he was also on Santa Barbara. So, but it's like little things like that that to fans, if I say Lorena Sharp, you go, oh yeah, of course, Lorena Sharp. So, and
do you remember who Greg Brady interacted with on GH?
Yes, he was the dance teacher that was people, and Emma Sam's Holly. He was. This was her way with Robert and Holly. It was a little bit of an I Love Lucy dynamic of Ricky, can I be in the show? So Robert was the police commissioner, and Holly wanted to do sleuthing. So yes, she was there with Greg Brady. Okay, give me another one. Come on, we can do this. This is fun.
Well, the thing is, I think what made the '80s great, aside from the stories and great characters in the main line, was because you had stuff. When the character of Packy was shot by Anthony Hand, the gangster between Frank Smith and Sonny was Anthony Hand. When he's shot and dies, I remember feeling sad. And again, this is a D-level character. Mike Webber was the kid you always kind of loathed because he wasn't played by too good an actor. He wasn't lucky. He wasn't sly.
Well, to be fair, in David Mendenhall's defense, he was absolutely terrible, but in the poor kid's defense, they were writing him as he was 8 up until he was 14. So he really, and he knew it, and he talked about that, is that he started on the show when he was about 8, and he was actually perfectly fine. And this is a kid, he was in a movie with Sylvester Stallone.
The arm wrestling one.
The point is, this kid was good, but on General Hospital, by the time they had the storyline with Ginny Blake and Judith Chapman as his biological mother, they were writing him as he was 8 and he was 14. So that's why it came off so weird.
And who was the kid who played Virgin Annie Logan's kid, the kid with the glasses?
Oh, yes, Philip Tanzini.
Yeah, there was a
problem. He said that when he started on the show, he was 10 playing 11, and when he left the show, he was 16 playing 11.
Yeah. And there was a photo of him kissing Demi Moore, and because there was some controversy a few years ago.
Yeah, but that was the same thing that so in the defense of both Philip Tanzini and David Mendenhall, they were actually very good young actors who were being asked to play 5-6 years younger, so they came off as completely demented. Yeah.
Now, here's the thing with the 90s. I think that 90s could have been even better. One of my favorite storylines was one that just came out of nowhere. I mentioned the brownstone. So Bobby answers, I think she answers a personal ad or something, or she sees an ad for a character we've never seen before, Joe Atkins, who turns out to be a notorious cop killer. So we don't know him. He turns out to have a younger brother who's a psychopath. Karen, Jason, and Jagger end up on an island in the middle of Lake Ontario or wherever it was. Yeah. And that was actually a pretty good story for teenagers there, but they never really followed up with as many good B or C level stories in the 90s as in the 80s. And now, you're lucky if today's A stories could have been C stories back then.
Well, here's a story that since you mentioned Bobby and that wonderful brownstone. So in the 80s, we have a storyline where Rose Kelly, remember Rose Kelly?
Yes. I loved her.
Okay, so Rose Kelly is dating Jake Meyer.
Yeah.
And the fact that she's Catholic and he's Jewish is a big problem. And eventually the story peters out and goes nowhere. And 2 years later, Jake marries Bobby, and who cares? Okay, I guess he got over that little minor Judaism thing. Good for him.
Yeah.
So those are kind of things. Whenever I think of Bobby and the brownstone, I think of all the characters who they didn't have stories for. They said, let's throw them all into one building so at least we can not have stories for them together.
And, speaking of retcons, it's not really a retcon, But why the hell did they have Carly rename Kelly's to Bobby's? You know, Bobby was.
Knows who Kelly is. Nobody knows who
Yeah.
Joe Kelly was, who was a very big
Well,
part
his
of
it was his father who owned the store.
Patty, yeah.
Patty
Patty Kelly, who was married to Rose.
Yeah.
And that was in the basement where we had Hutch, the killer,
Yeah.
bleed out in Rose's
And
basement.
I interviewed him too, Rick Moses. Terrific,
Yes.
very interesting guy. He actually, speaking of Jewishness, he actually converted to Judaism.
Oh, does he? Okay, I guess he meant more to him than it did to Jake Meyer. So, but that's the kind of thing. Kelly's at the 80s, and it's peak 80s. And we were talking about how it wasn't just Luke and Laura, because during the Luke and Laura story, we have Hutch bleeding out in Rose's basement, and it turns into a love story.
And you know a character, I mentioned Brian Patrick Clark. I asked him, what actor on GH that you worked with did you think was going to become big outside of the soaps and never did? Remember Celia Quartermain?
Oh, yes, Sherilyn Walter.
I thought she was terrific in her 3 years on there. I mean,
She was terrific. And then a couple of years later, she was on Santa Barbara as Psycho, and she was fabulous. And then a little bit after that, she was on Guiding Light as a hired killer, and she was very good too. She had wonderful range.
Is she still acting?
No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, again, I don't know what anybody's doing. You know, there's theaters all over the country where people could be working, but I haven't seen her name in the credits.
Because it's nothing against Jeannie Francis, who I think has also been capable of being great at times. But most of the times, especially as she's gotten older, I actually liked her as Sarah Connor on All My Children for a while. But every time she comes back, it seems like it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of Laura.
Like we were talking about Pod Holly, it happens all the time. They bring these characters back, and they don't know what made them appealing in the first place.
Right.
So they just want them to fill whatever gap they wanted to fill. And actually, speaking of Ginny Francis, I want to address a little bit. She was treated horribly by ABC multiple times, including, you know, the reason she left All My Children. It was not her choice. She was very happy. She wanted to be in New York. She wanted to be doing theater. She liked playing Sierra. But ABC basically said to her, Tony Geary's not working as Bill Eckert on General Hospital. We're going to bring back Luke and Laura. Your contract isn't with All My Children. Your contract is with ABC. We're moving you to General Hospital, whether you like it or not. Jean has been treated very badly. But the other thing I wanted to address is all of the attention went to Tony Geary. Tony Geary won the Emmys, you know, with Luke and Laura. Jeannie wasn't even nominated. And I think there was this sense that, oh, Tony could have done this with anybody. And I think it overlooked the fact that, considering how young she was, Jeannie was 18, 19, 20, you know, she was like 15 years younger than Tony. And the fact that she held up her end, because as we saw, no, Tony can't do it with just anyone. He couldn't do it with Janine Turner. He couldn't do it with Demi Moore. He couldn't do it with all the women they threw at Bill Eckert. So they made it seem like he was a one-man band, and he's not. And the fact is, Jeannie has never really been given her flowers for the work that she did to make Luke and Laura happen. They made it seem like, you remember when it was just Laura, was just like a hair on a stick, when they didn't have Jeannie Francis and it was like a mop and then just a wig. They made it seem like that's what Tony was acting against, and he was not. And I think she deserves a lot more credit than she got at the time for making that pairing the phenomenon that it was.
So let's look forward now. We've talked about GH. We 60 years, I think we covered a lot of the high points. But I mentioned how the decline of soaps, and now we have this Beyond the Gates. I just saw John Lindstrom now plays a mobster on that.
Yeah, because Michelle Valjean, who's the head writer, wrote on General Hospital for many years. She wrote the Elizabeth Rape story. She's a phenomenal writer, and she loves John, so she brought John over to Beyond the Gates, playing a very different character.
So what do you think the future of soaps is? I think the way to go is to involve minorities more, because look at what's happened with game shows. The game shows, most of them are hosted by and most of them are watched by blacks and Latinos. Steve Harvey is a superstar in the game show world, even more so than Richard Dawson ever was doing Family Feud. But, you know, if this Beyond the Gates is mostly a black soap opera, I've always wondered, why wasn't there ever a Hispanic Waltons or a black Little House on the Prairie? I want to see characters like that.
The reason, at least when I worked at P&G, the reasoning was that the Hispanic audience has the telenovelas. So, and they didn't want to compete. No,
Yeah.
let's be honest. They didn't want to compete with the telenovelas because they would lose. Because if you're competing with the telenovelas, you can't. There's so many of them. They're internationally successful. You know, they'd even do adaptations like Ugly Betty, and other shows were actually adaptations of telenovelas. But here's the thing. When people talk about the future of soaps, I want to talk about the fact that when soaps were on the air, when we talk, whether it was the 50s, with radio soaps transitioning to TV, whether it was the 70s and 80s and the heydays of soaps, they were the only serialized content available. If you loved serials, that was the way to go. Now everything is a soap. Think of Friends. Friends was a soap. I'm not even talking about your Grey's Anatomy and your ER.
Everything
is serialized.
Yeah.
Everything is, whether it's Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Friends, or even a sitcom like Georgie and Mandy's First Marriage, is sort of the first one that came to mind. Everything is serialized now. So I think when people talk about the death of soaps, what they don't realize is that everything is the soaps. The soaps lost because they won.
Yeah. Let's talk about the future of GH then. My favorite character on the show is woefully underused, and that's Curtis Ashford, speaking of black characters. I think there's a gold mine to be mined from that family. Think about Brian and Claudia. Do you remember Brian and Claudia? The original Oreos.
Well, if anyone can remember Brian and Claudia, when I covered for Soap Hub, I covered the premiere of Beyond the Gates at the Paley Center in New York. And when they had a panel of not just the actors, but they had Sheila Duckworth, who is the executive producer who basically brought this show to fruition. She talked about how when she was a kid, Brian and Claudia were the only representation she had. And she would rush home to watch them and hope that she would see them. So I definitely remember Brian and Claudia, and not only me, but the woman who created Beyond the Gates remembers Brian and Claudia. And I remember when Sammy Davis Jr. guest starred as his deadbeat dad.
Yeah. And, you know, the thing is, you look at the 2020s, remember Love in the Afternoon? That's pretty much gone. I mean, not that I was that particularly big on it. I like the action, but I also like seeing pretty women in teddies walking around. And yet you don't see that. The 2020s are so much more conservative than the 1980s. Are we ever going to get a swing back?
Here's the thing. I don't know how much of it is conservative, and I don't know, and I wonder how much of it has to do with a tight production schedule. Not that it takes more to shoot someone shirtless than it doesn't, but the fact is we're seeing fewer sets. We're seeing fewer set-ups. So from what I'm hearing, the actors that I interviewed for my book, several of them told me about how they don't even have rehearsal anymore. They just come in and they shoot straight. And so I think the reason we're not seeing some big swings is because big swings take time and money that a lot of soaps just don't have anymore. Now, Bill Bell, the guy who had written for Guiding Light and Days of Our Lives and created Young and the Restless and The Bold and the Beautiful, he always says, just give me a good script, 2 talented actors, and a waterfall, and who needs the waterfall? So the fact is, you should be able to write compelling television, which 2 people should be able to recite in the front of and now with green screens, they should be able to do it anywhere.
Yeah.
So, but on the other hand, look at The Young and the Restless, they fired their breakdown writers. It used to be head writer, breakdown writer, script writers. Now their head writer is doing all the breakdowns, and you can see it. One man or woman or whoever cannot do all of that work. So I think a lot of what we're seeing in the soaps not trying new things is a financial issue.
And I've heard the term. What is a breakdown writer versus? I know what the other 2 are.
A breakdown writer is basically, you're told that in this episode, Carly and Sonny will kiss, Robin will be self-righteous, and Laura will run for office. They basically write prologue 1, scene 1.
Okay.
Robin walked into the hospital and she and Jason talk about puppies. The breakdown writer is the step before it turns the long story of the head writer into the day's episode that the script writer will write dialogue for.
So I'll give you my ideas, and then I want your ideas of how I would make GH much more compelling than it is, and maybe not because of financial considerations. Maybe you can't go back to the 80s with the tramway and Robert and Sean, but
that you can't do.
Yeah, but I mentioned the Ashford family. I find most of them pretty interesting. I actually like the auntie. You know, I would bring someone maybe in the years from raising the Ashford boys till she appears. Maybe she's got some dark secret in her past. I would bring TJ back for God's sakes, but put him, you know, have him battle with the what's his name, the dummy, the dumb guy for Molly. What's his name? Bell.
Isaiah?
Cody Bell. Cody Bell. Yeah.
Cody.
Yeah, I'd do that. You know, I'd put Jordan or Portia. You know, let them walk around in teddies here or there. You know, bring on Hispanic characters who aren't bad guys. Like I remember who was the real tattooed guy that was a real 20 years ago. He was a real psychopath. He was from Miami. He had a brother who was a
one Carlos Rhoda played, or am I thinking of someone else?
It might be, but you know who I'm talking about. The guy who had the tattoos all over his body. He, you know, let's get a real interesting Hispanic family. It can be Cuban, Puerto Rican, Mexican. I don't care. Let's get someone who's Latino on there, and then you make the main families the Webbers, the Quartermains. These two families. Maybe Sonny gets shot and you see him just maybe he's flipping flapjacks in Bobby's, you know, for the rest of his life. He
was never more interesting to me than when he had amnesia and was just working at
and then you can do like, remember they did the 4 Jasons episode a decade ago. What happened if Jason hadn't gotten shot, gotten the accident?
They did that with Sunny. They did that with Sunny as well, which is how we found out Robin would have.
So I would move it away from this constant, you know, faux existential darkness. You know, I hate when people think darkness is somehow more complex or deep or dramatic than having, you know, good, interesting characters who may stumble. You know, the guy who's married for 25 years and he goes to the high school reunion and he slips up in his marriage vows or something. Or you know, the doctor who isn't a total dumb. You know, whatever's happened to the co-chief of staff, Terry, the only trans character that I know of on the soaps. Maybe there's others. You know, she went with the guy we call him Chud, cannibalistic. You remember the guy with the like, that was the new Amy's brother. So what would you do if you could do 3 or 4 things to make GAHJ something close to what it was?
Well, you brought it up earlier when you said Sonny, Carly, and Jason always win.
Yeah.
Just having it so that they don't always win would already add drama.
Right.
It would fundamentally add drama. It's kind of like the show Law and Order. In their early years, if you watch Law and Order, the prosecution didn't always win. In fact, it was almost 50-50 whether they won a case or they lost a case.
Same thing with Edge of Night.
Yeah. And then in its last 10 years on Law and Order, they almost always win. And that really takes the drama and the day-to-day excitement. You know, they say on the edge of my seat, tune in tomorrow. So the first foremost thing is that you have to stop making Carly, Sonny, and Jason completely infallible. Because if we know that they can lose... In fact, remember when Blonde Jagger returned, there was a glorious couple of weeks when suddenly everyone wasn't worshiping Sonny.
Yeah.
Jagger even said to Anna, you know, Anna, you are in law enforcement. You know, I know we had the scar and I know we had the treasure and I know our lives are, you know, our checkered past. But Anna, you are in law enforcement. And when he said to her, you know, the reason you are like this with Sonny is because he was there for Robin when you weren't. And this is your guilt speaking. And I was like, oh, my God, what incredible writing. Let's have more of that, please. Then that ended. Yeah. That was a glorious couple of weeks, and then they went away. So that's the main thing I would do. It doesn't matter what the story was, but I would have more tension and drama by the fact that we don't always know from the beginning of every tale who's going to win and who's going to lose.
And you'd mentioned about everything being a soap opera. You also mentioned earlier about the Prospect Park thing a decade or so ago, which I guess the character rights and whatnot, all that screwed that up. What do you think of do you think we will still have soap operas as they are now in 2050?
it depends, as my children would say, as they are now, is doing a lot of lifting in that sentence. So the question becomes, if you mean a half hour or an hour every day, 5 days a week, I don't think so. But I think serialization is, well, first of all, as I started, when we started an hour and a half ago, I said it's not even Erna Phillips and the shows that she creates in the 30s and 40s. It's Dickens and the serials and all of that. Serialization will all, Scheherazade. Let's just be really basic. The concept of tune in tomorrow to find out what happens is always going to be with people. I think with the technology we have, we might do more of a choose your own adventure thing, for lack of a better thing, that people will actually be able to customize their experience. I mean, how many of us, I don't know about you, but when I first got the VCRs for soaps and I taped the entire ABC lineup, it literally started with Loving and Ryan's Hope, and I went all the way through Edge of Night. As you can see, I wasted a lot of my childhood. But I wouldn't watch every single scene. I would fast forward through and see the characters I wanted. And my daughter, who's 18, right now, she watches old shows like Grey's Anatomy and West Wing and shows like that. Yes, those are old shows, but she only watches characters she likes. She watches edits of characters that she likes. She jumps around. She doesn't even watch the episodes linearly. So, and I think that we have the technology that the storytelling is going to change, but serialization, apart from soap operas, will always be with us, because that's just human nature. We always want to know, and then what happened? When somebody tells you some gossip about your neighbor, don't you want to hear, and then what happened?
And my final thought before we end here, I mentioned about the Prometheus disc with Brian Patrick Clark playing the Grants in there. And I saw a cut about 2 or 3 years ago of the Prometheus thing. It's like 823 10-minute slices on YouTube. And I remember there was one thing that was odd. It was before he was revealed as a DBX spy. Natalie was doing something. She was at the Quartermains, and you saw, because Grant was with Celia, Grant Putnam Andrews was with Celia, and as the spy thing is going on, you just see Grant walk in, and he makes a telephone call, and he looks around, and he has a little thing, and I thought, I watched that almost religiously. Those episodes, I never saw that before. So it was interesting how this person who was maniacal enough to cut together 800 plus episodes there of 10-minute slices got something. And I'm thinking 35 years later or whatever it was, like, oh, they actually revealed it in that scene. And I wonder how many, were there 2 or 3 other clues that I missed in the original way? And those are the kinds of things I miss, because if I see a character now and it's a character that I'm trying to think of a character that Carly is bemoaning something, she's bemoaning one of her children again. It's like, I know that I don't care if I missed one little thing there, but that little episode, that little 10-minute or 10-second phone call that Grant makes that I didn't recall him ever making, that went off. Anyway, it was a pleasure speaking to you, Alina. Maybe we can do it again in a few years or something if something terrible happens. I did see, though, in memoriam for GH, there was a YouTube clip. I think more people from the 80s and 90s died in 2025. There's Tristan and...
Up here for GH. I think it was Leslie Charlson, Tristan
Andre
Rogers.
Landazat.
It was not a great year for General Hospital this year in their alumni.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.